If you've spent any time watching videos on this channel, then you already know people in the Middle Ages could meet some unbelievably brutal ends. So instead of easing into today's subject, I'm going to dive right into the topic that the analytics say all you wonderfully twisted history fans keep asking for. Today, I'm taking a trip back through time to meet a few medieval people whose lives ended in dark, heartbreaking, and truly tragic ways. Sometimes, all it took was being in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Near the end of the 13th century, the Commune of Laon in northern France was shaken by a series of violent uprisings and political unrest. On a Saturday in February of 1295, two noble men-at-arms, John de Ecourt and John d'Anjou, got into a bitter dispute with the city's deputy mayor, John de Milly. Things quickly turned ugly when d'Anjou lost his temper and punched the deputy mayor square in the face. In response, the mayor's servants rushed in and brutally beat both men. Realizing they could expect no mercy, John de Ecourt, John d'Anjou, and John's brother Peter de Ecourt, who served as a church clerk, fled to the sanctuary of Laon Cathedral in hopes of finding protection. The three men retreated to what seemed like the safest place in the entire church. They were given shelter inside the cathedral's vaulted bell tower, where they spent the night believing they had finally escaped the violence. By early Sunday morning, however, the people of Laon had surrounded the cathedral. They were furious with the clergy for giving refuge to the fugitives, and a large armed crowd gathered outside. Even with the city demanding their surrender, the three men refused to come out. While the nuns were singing their prayers, an armed mob forced its way into the cathedral. The attackers overwhelmed the king's guards, who had been stationed there to defend the church, and then smashed through the locked doors leading to the bell tower. Although the dean tried desperately to stop the attack, the mob reached the hiding place and dragged the two men-at-arms and the clerk from their sanctuary. They were beaten so severely that blood was spilled throughout the cathedral itself, a shocking violation of the church's sacred ground. The attackers grabbed the men by their hair and dragged them through the streets while striking them over and over. As the crowd followed behind, anyone who wanted to join the assault did exactly that. The three victims were mercilessly beaten with fists, pelted with stones, and struck with sticks and blades from every direction. When the violence finally ended, John and Peter de Ecourt were left lying in the street, barely alive after the savage beating. John d'Anjou was taken instead to the town's common jail, where his suffering only grew worse. He was tortured, and the tendons in his feet were slashed. After enduring those horrific injuries for several days, he finally died. Back in the Middle Ages, treason was considered one of the worst crimes a person could possibly commit, and the punishment reflected that. In 1302, a Flemish nobleman named Simon Hannibar was found guilty of treason, and instead of receiving a single sentence, he was condemned to endure two of the harshest punishments anyone could imagine. One of those punishments was being broken on the wheel. To carry out the execution, the condemned man would be tied to a large wagon wheel with his arms and legs stretched out. The executioner would then force a heavy weapon through the gaps between the spokes, crushing the victim's arms and legs until the bones snapped. Another version of the same punishment involved laying the prisoner across wooden blocks arranged to match the shape of a wheel. Starting at the feet, the executioner would slowly work his way upward, delivering one devastating blow after another and breaking bone after bone in a deliberate, painful sequence. If a victim was fortunate, the ordeal ended with one final strike to the head or neck. Otherwise, the shattered body would be lifted onto the wheel and left suspended in public, where death came slowly over time. Simon, however, was not one of the lucky ones. After enduring the agony of being broken on the wheel, he was removed from it with his body completely shattered. But his suffering wasn't over. He was then sentenced to face a second brutal punishment, being drawn and quartered. Brunhild of Austrasia served as queen consort to King Sigebert I during the late 6th century. Over the years, she became one of the most influential rulers in the eastern Frankish kingdoms of Austrasia and Burgundy. She is best remembered for her bitter and long-running feud with Queen Fredegund of Neustria, who was widely believed to have arranged the murders of Brunhild's sister and her first husband. After those tragedies, Brunhild continued to rule as regent for her sons, grandsons, and eventually even her great-grandson. Throughout her years in power, she earned the support and friendship of influential church leaders such as Gregory the Great and Gregory of Tours. Their relationship helped shape the lasting spread of Catholic Christianity throughout the Frankish kingdoms. In the end, however, even her power wasn't enough. It took the combined strength of the dukes from two allied kingdoms to finally overcome the Austrasian forces loyal to her. Once Brunhild and the young king of Austrasia were captured, her enemies wasted no time. The young king was executed almost immediately, according to one account. Then the armies of the Franks and Burgundians united as one, and together they cried out that death was the most fitting punishment for the deeply wicked Brunhild, despite her advanced age. After that, King Clothar ordered that she be placed on a camel and paraded through the entire army so everyone could see her humiliation. When the procession ended, she was tied to the feet of wild horses, which pulled her apart in a brutal execution. That was the end of Brunhild's life. After her death, her remains were placed on a funeral pyre, and her bones were burned. In the early 13th century, a man known as Inalchuk served as the governor of Otrar in the Khwarezm Empire, located in Central Asia. When Genghis Khan sent a large trade caravan to the city, Inalchuk made a disastrous decision. He ordered the merchants' goods to be confiscated, and every member of the delegation was executed. As you can probably imagine, Genghis Khan didn't take that lightly. The murder of even a single envoy was enough to start a war in those days. But the killing of around 450 merchants and officials wasn't just an insult, it was a direct challenge to his authority. Genghis Khan responded the only way he knew how. He gathered his massive Mongol army and marched on Otrar. In 1219, the Mongols reached the city's walls and launched a full-scale siege. As the defenses collapsed, Inalchuk withdrew into the city's inner fortress with several hundred loyal soldiers, determined to make one final stand. Because Genghis Khan had given strict orders to capture him alive, the Mongols couldn't simply kill him during the assault. Instead, they carried out a careful and relentless siege that dragged on for nearly a month while Inalchuk's defenders launched desperate, almost suicidal attacks against the invading army. In the end, though, there was no escaping defeat. Trapped on the upper levels of the fortress and running out of options, the defenders began tearing bricks from the walls and hurling them down at the Mongols below in a last, hopeless attempt to hold them back. Eventually, the fortress fell. Inalchuk was captured alive, placed in chains, and taken away as the Mongols leveled the city around him. According to one historical account, his execution was especially infamous. It claims that molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment said to symbolize both revenge and complete disgrace. Whether every detail is true or not, the story has endured as a reminder of one lesson that few dared to ignore. Challenging Genghis Khan came with consequences few people survived. Inferno is the first part of Dante's 14th-century masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. In it, Dante tells the story of his own journey through hell while being guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. In Canto 33, the two travelers come across a horrifying sight. They find two condemned souls trapped together in the same frozen pit, with only their heads visible above the surface. One of them, Count Ugolino, is condemned to spend eternity gnawing on the head of the man beside him. The haunting dream Dante describes, along with the heartbreaking suffering of Ugolino's children, is a work of literary imagination. But the real historical events that inspired the story are, sadly, based on an actual tragedy. Count Ugolino della Gherardesca, the Count of Donoratico, was an Italian nobleman, naval commander, and influential politician. In 1288, the city of Pisa was torn apart by riots caused by severe food shortages. During the violence, Ugolino killed the nephew of the archbishop in a skirmish. the archbishop responded by publicly accusing Ugolino of treason, turning the people of Pisa against him. Before long, Ugolino, along with one of his sons and his grandsons, was arrested and imprisoned inside the Tower of Muda. In March of 1289, the archbishop declared himself podestà, giving himself the highest political authority in the city. Then he made a decision that would become one of the darkest episodes in medieval history. Instead of allowing food to be delivered to the prisoners as it had been before, he ordered the tower to be permanently sealed. The keys were thrown into the Arno River, ensuring no one could reach the captives. Locked inside with no hope of rescue, Ugolino and the young members of his family were abandoned to a slow and agonizing death by starvation. During the 100 Years' War, in the summer of 1358, northern France was shaken by a massive peasant uprising. The rebellion, known as the Jacquerie, lasted for roughly 2 months before it was finally crushed after a wave of violence. The revolt reportedly began in a small village where a group of peasants gathered to talk about what they believed was the nobility's betrayal of King John II at the Battle of Poitiers. During that battle, the English army, led by Edward the Black Prince, defeated the French forces and captured King John, leaving many common people convinced that their leaders had failed them. One of the best-known chroniclers of the time, the 14th-century writer Jean le Bel, recorded accounts of the violence that followed. He described acts so horrific that he admitted he could hardly bring himself to write about them. As he put it, "I would not dare write or tell of their atrocious deeds or of the indecorous things they did to ladies." Among the stories he recorded was one especially gruesome account. He claimed that the rebels killed a knight, placed his body on a spit, and roasted it while his wife and children were forced to watch. He also wrote that after a group of 10 or 12 men assaulted the knight's wife, they attempted to force her and her children to eat the roasted flesh of their husband and father. Whether every detail of these stories is historically accurate remains a matter of debate. Even so, accounts of sexual violence and cannibalism served a powerful purpose. To medieval audiences, these stories portrayed the rebels as people who had fallen completely beyond redemption, using shocking imagery to reinforce that message. The wealthy weren't the only ones who suffered during these uprisings. Another revolt in France, led by a group known as the Teutons, workers and craftsmen from the south who were enraged by the heavy taxes imposed to finance the king's wars, also produced terrible acts of violence. One of their victims was an unfortunate priest traveling to the papal curia in Rome. According to one account, the rebels attacked him purely because they hated and distrusted his position within the church. The chronicler claims they cut off the ends of his fingers, stripped the skin from his body with shears, and finally burned him alive. György Dózsa was a soldier from Transylvania in the Kingdom of Hungary. In the early 16th century, during the reign of King Vladislaus II, he rose to lead a massive peasant revolt against the Hungarian nobility. The rebellion was eventually crushed in 1514, when Dózsa's forces were defeated by an army of around 20,000 men. After the battle, he was captured alive and sentenced to one of the most infamous executions of the medieval period. Because he had dared to challenge the ruling class and was accused of wanting to become a peasant king, his captors turned his execution into a cruel spectacle of mockery. They seated him on an iron throne, which they slowly heated until the metal became unbearably hot. Then they forced a glowing iron crown onto his head and placed a burning scepter into his hands, mocking him as their king. He was made to endure this unimaginable torment for more than an hour. When that wasn't enough, his executioners used red-hot iron pincers to tear pieces of flesh from his body. As this horrific punishment continued, hymns of praise were sung while musicians played nearby. At the same time, several of Dózsa's followers, who had been deliberately starved beforehand, were forced to stand in line and eat the flesh that had been torn from his body. Those who refused were executed on the spot, while the ones who obeyed were allowed to live. After suffering through this unimaginable ordeal, Dózsa finally died in agony. His punishment didn't end there. What remained of his body was cut into pieces, and the remains were sent to different parts of Hungary to be displayed as a grim warning to anyone else who might consider leading a rebellion. György Doza was a soldier from Transylvania in the Kingdom of Hungary. In the early 16th century, during the reign of King Vladislaus II, he rose to lead a massive peasant revolt against the Hungarian nobility. The rebellion was eventually crushed in 1514 when Dosa's forces were defeated by an army of around 20,000 men. After the battle, he was captured alive and sentenced to one of the most infamous executions of the medieval period. Because he had dared to challenge the ruling class and was accused of wanting to become a peasant king, his captors turned his execution into a cruel spectacle of mockery. They seated him on an iron throne, which they slowly heated until the metal became unbearably hot. Then they forced a glowing iron crown onto his head and placed a burning scepter into his hands, mocking him as their king. He was made to endure this unimaginable torment for more than an hour. When that wasn't enough, his executioners used red-hot iron pincers to tear pieces of flesh from his body. As this horrific punishment continued, hymns of praise were sung while musicians played nearby. At the same time, several of Dosa's followers, who had been deliberately starved beforehand, were forced to stand in line and eat the flesh that had been torn from his body. Those who refused were executed on the spot, while the ones who obeyed were allowed to live. After suffering through this unimaginable ordeal, Dosa finally died in agony. His punishment didn't end there. What remained of his body was cut into pieces, and the remains were sent to different parts of Hungary to be displayed as a grim warning to anyone else who might consider leading a rebellion. Balthasar Gérard was born in the county of Burgundy in eastern France. In 1580, King Philip II of Spain announced an extraordinary reward, 25,000 crowns, a noble title, and land for anyone who could capture or kill William the Silent, the leader of the Dutch revolt. In The Rise of the Dutch Republic, historian John Lothrop Motley describes William as a pest to all Christianity and an enemy of the human race. Gérard decided he would be the man to claim that reward. He succeeded in his mission by shooting William, becoming the first known person to assassinate a head of state with a handheld firearm. His escape, however, didn't last long. He was captured almost immediately, and the punishment that followed was almost beyond imagination. The sentence began with Gérard being tied to a pole, where he was severely whipped. After that, his wounds were covered with honey, and a goat was brought in to lick them with its rough tongue, making the pain even more unbearable. That first night, he was left tightly bound, making it nearly impossible for him to sleep. Over the next 3 days, the torture continued. He was suspended with his hands tied behind his back while heavy weights were fastened to his big toes, putting constant strain on his body. His executioners then forced him into shoes made from uncured dog skin. The shoes had been intentionally made too small. When Gérard was placed in front of a fire, the leather shrank as it heated, crushing his feet inside. When the shoes were finally removed, much of the damaged skin came off with them. The torment didn't stop there. His armpits were branded with hot irons. He was dressed in a shirt soaked with alcohol, and boiling bacon fat was poured over his body. Finally, nails were driven beneath the fingernails and toenails of both his hands and feet. When all of that was over, Gérard was taken to the market square in Delft for his public execution. According to the official sentence, it was decreed that the right hand of Gérard should be burnt off with a red-hot iron, that his flesh should be torn from his bones with pincers in 6 different places, that he should be quartered and disemboweled alive, that his heart should be torn from his breast and thrown into his face, and that finally his head should be cut off. Despite everything he had endured, contemporary accounts claim that Gérard showed extraordinary endurance. One report even stated that, although he was crippled and half-roasted as he climbed the scaffold, he remained remarkably calm throughout the final moments of his life. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Medieval Madness. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help support the channel, please consider joining us on Patreon, where we upload an exclusive extra video every month. You can also become a YouTube member to get the same bonus content. If you'd like to support the channel even more, we also have a higher membership tier that lets your name appear on screen at the end of videos, just like the amazing people you're seeing right now. Thanks again for all your support. I truly appreciate every single one of you, and as always, I'll see you next week with another video. Cheers!